I think the thing that breaks me, even now, is not the money. I want to be clear about that from the start. Because when people hear the number, and I will tell you the number, they assume the money is the wound. It is not the money. The money is just the visible part. The part that shows up on a bank statement and a police report, and a very uncomfortable phone call with my son in Bristol. The actual wound is something else, something that does not have a column in any ledger I ever maintained in 40 years behind a counter, and I am still working out exactly what to call it. My name is Harold. I am 74 years old. I spent my entire working life as a bank clerk at the same Barclays branch in Swindon, starting in 1969, when you still wrote transactions by hand in large ledger books, and finishing in 2009, when everything was digital, and I was one of the oldest people in the building, by a margin that was becoming noticeable. 40 years of other people's money. 40 years of watching it come in and go out and move between accounts and accrue interest and get borrowed and repaid and occasionally disappear in ways that triggered the procedures I knew by memory. I understood banks the way some men understand cars or gardens. Not theoretically, not academically, but from the inside, from the repetition of daily contact over decades. I knew what a forged signature looked like. I had flagged them. I had sat in the back office with the branch manager and the documents laid out on the table and explained exactly what was wrong with the pen pressure, the letter formation, the angle of the loop on a capital H. I know what you are thinking, and you are right. Hold that thought, because I am going to come back to it. I never married. This is the background detail that matters and that I find, at 74, neither embarrassing nor particularly sad. It is simply true, the way a great many things about a life are simply true once you have had enough time to stop being defensive about them. There was a woman in the 1980s, Patricia, a secondary school teacher from Cirencester, and we were together for 6 years and came close to something formal but did not get there. And when it ended without drama, and I think without lasting damage to either of us. After Patricia, there were occasional companionships, nothing that became a permanent arrangement. And by the time I retired, I had settled into a version of solitude that was comfortable in the way that any long-standing habit becomes comfortable. Not ideal, perhaps, but known. And knowing is its own kind of ease. What I had, instead of a family, was money. Not ostentatiously. Not in the way of someone who had made large strategic decisions at the right moments. I had simply saved, carefully and consistently, for 40 years. In the way that a man who processes other people's financial lives every working day develops a clear-eyed respect for what money can and cannot do. I did not spend on things I did not need. I paid off my mortgage in Swindon by the time I was 53. I put the maximum into my pension from the day the scheme allowed it. By retirement, the combination of the pension, the ISA I had been feeding quietly since ISAs were introduced, and the savings accumulated in the straightforward way of a man who buys his suits from Marks & Spencer and takes his holidays in Wales, came to £195,000 in liquid assets. Not a fortune by any standard, but mine. Every penny of it earned through patience and frugality, and the discipline of knowing exactly what a pound was worth, because I had spent 4 decades counting other people's. Thailand arrived in my life through a retired colleague named Neil, who had worked in the loans department at the same branch for 22 years, before leaving to set up a financial advisory practice in Wiltshire. Neil had retired 2 years before me, and had, by the time I saw him at a branch reunion in 2011, undergone a transformation that I can only describe as alarming in the specific way that contentment is alarming when you encounter it in a person who was previously miserable. He was tanned. He was lighter, in the physical and other sense. He had been spending 3 months a year in Pattaya, on the eastern Gulf coast of Thailand, and he talked about it with the restraint of a man who has learned that enthusiasm is counterproductive when the thing you are enthusiastic about is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. He did not oversell it to me, and I think this is why it eventually worked. He said the cost of living was manageable on a pension. He said the weather was good, and the food was interesting, and the pace was different from Britain, in ways that took some adjustment, but that he had found, on balance, agreeable. He said I should come out and see for myself, and that his place in Naklua, the quieter residential area north of central Pattaya, away from the tourist strips, had a spare room and I was welcome to use it for a few weeks. I went in February, 2 years after I retired. I was 66 and I had never been to Asia, and I arrived at Suvarnabhumi with the careful, slightly anxious preparedness of a man who has spent his life being organized and who does not find unfamiliarity easy. I had the address written on a card. I had the baht already exchanged at a post office in Swindon. I had a printed copy of Neil's phone number in case my mobile failed. Pattaya, when I arrived, was not what I expected. I had formed an image from what I had read, which was probably the wrong thing to have read, and the reality was more layered and more ordinary than the image. Naklua, where Neil's apartment was, had the quality of an actual neighborhood, a place where people bought vegetables at the morning market and drove motorbikes through the side streets, and had entirely routine daily lives that had nothing to do with the things Pattaya is known for in the tabloids. There was a coast road along the bay north of the city where you could walk in the mornings before the heat built, with the Gulf of Thailand on one side and the low-rise buildings and garden restaurants on the other. And I walked it every morning for 3 weeks and found that it did something useful to the particular quality of stillness that retirement had deposited in my life. I met Mook in the second week. Not dramatically, I want to be precise about this, because the drama is not in the meeting but in everything that came after. I was at the branch of Kasikorn Bank on the Naklua Road, trying to sort out a temporary account for managing local expenses, and she was the customer service representative who handled my application. She was 23, though I did not know her age at that point. She had the careful, professional manner of someone who has been trained to put customers at ease, which I now understand was not coincidental, given what she did for a living. Her English was good, better than I had encountered in most of the service interactions I had had that week, precise in the specific vocabulary of financial administration. She explained the account requirements, the identification needed, the minimum balance, the fee structure. She was, I think the word is, competent, and she was attentive in the particular way that feels personal even when it is professional, which in a bank environment was something I recognized as a skill because I had practiced it myself for 40 years. Looking back, and looking back is most of what I do now with this story, I think about that first meeting with a clarity that is almost painful. She worked in a bank. She knew signature verification processes. She knew how joint accounts were structured and what documentation was required to operate them. She knew what a legitimate transaction looked like and, by precise inversion, what a fraudulent one needed to mimic in order to pass. She was, in the vocabulary of what eventually happened, perfectly positioned. And I sat across the counter from her and thought, she is good at her job. I went back to England at the end of February. I came back in November, partly because the winter in Swindon had decided in October to be specifically miserable, and partly because I had thought about Pattaya with a regularity that told me something about what the place had given me, even in 3 weeks. Neil had moved into a bigger place in Naklua by then, and was perfectly happy to have the company. I stayed for 6 weeks. I saw Mook twice during that visit. Once because I had a question about the account and went to the bank. Once, near the end of my stay, because she was at the morning market on a Saturday and recognized me, and we talked for perhaps 20 minutes, while a man behind her sold pomelos from the back of a truck. I realize now that I was managing a set of feelings I had not had for a long time, and which I handled with the subtlety of a man who has not had to handle them for several decades, which is to say, not subtly at all. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was simply enjoying a conversation with a pleasant person in a pleasant place, that it was nothing more than the agreeable texture of life in a country that suited me. I told myself this with the energy of someone who is already aware, at some level, that they are telling themselves something. The third trip was in February of the following year. By this point, I had begun the serious research into the retirement visa, the non-immigrant OA, the financial requirements, the renewal process, and had decided, or was deciding, that spending longer periods in Thailand was something I wanted to pursue. Neil, who had by then spent 4 years in Naklua and had developed the slightly proprietary attitude of a man who knows a place well, was supportive of this in the measured way he was supportive of most things. He told me it was a good decision, practically. He also told me, over dinner at a restaurant near the coast road that served excellent grilled fish, that I should be careful. He did not specify careful about what. He said it in the general way that people say it when they mean something specific, but are not sure you want to hear the specific version. I said I knew what I was doing. I did not, of course, know what I was doing, in the precise sense that mattered. I knew the financial side. I knew the visa side. I had studied the relevant processes with the thoroughness of a man who spent his career understanding systems. What I did not know, and what I am not sure any amount of study would have told me, was what it felt like to be 70 years old and sitting in a Naklua garden restaurant at 8 in the evening with the warm air coming off the Gulf and a woman 31 years younger than me, telling me, with what felt like genuine interest, about the differences between how Thai banks handled signature verification and how she imagined British banks did it. That specific combination of circumstances was not covered in any document I had read. Mook and I had begun, by that third trip, something that I did not have a confident word for at the time, and that I now simply call a relationship, because that is the accurate word, regardless of what I might prefer it to have been. She was not pursuing me, in any obvious sense. There was no manufactured urgency, no early declaration of feeling, no request for money that might have activated the skepticism I possessed in other contexts. She seemed, or performed being, genuinely interested in me as a person, in the specific content of 40 years in banking, in the particular things I found interesting, and the things I found tedious, and the way I thought about money, which was, it turned out, the most important thing in the world to her, for reasons I did not yet understand. In April of that year, I moved into a rented apartment in Naklua, a 20-minute walk from Neil's place, a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a low building with a small balcony facing the bay. The rent was 18,000 baht per month, which at the rate then was approximately £400. I was aware that this was a very good price for what I had, and I was quietly pleased with myself about it, which I mention because the frugality that had served me well for 40 years had a blind spot in it that I was not conscious of and that Mook had identified very early. The blind spot was this. I was careful about prices and fees and exchange rates and the small transactional costs of daily life, in the way that a former bank clerk naturally is. I checked everything. I compared. I kept records in a small notebook I bought at a stationery shop on the Naklua Road, entering every expense in the clear, slightly old-fashioned handwriting I had developed over decades of writing in ledgers. But I was not careful, in the same forensic way, about the larger structural decisions, the ones that happen not at the level of a market transaction, but at the level of trust, the ones that required not price comparison but character assessment. And character assessment was not a skill I had spent 40 years developing. I think this is the thing I come back to most. Not the fraud itself, but the architecture of how I came to be vulnerable to it. A lifetime of diligence about pennies, and a lifetime of naivety about people. Those two things coexisting in the same person, the same brain, the same careful hands that had flagged forged signatures across a counter, and never once turned the same scrutiny on itself. Mook moved into the apartment with me in June. This was, I told myself, a practical arrangement. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, the rent was reasonable, and the alternative was that she would continue commuting from a room she rented with 2 other women in a part of Pattaya that was further from the bank. I told myself these things, and they were true, in the way that practical justifications are true when they are also covering for something less practical. Neil, when I mentioned it at dinner, put down his fork and looked at me in the way he had looked at me in the Naklua restaurant 6 months earlier, and then picked up his fork again. He said nothing. I did not ask him to say nothing. He simply assessed the situation and decided, which was his right. The joint account was opened in August. This was Mook's suggestion, framed as a practicality. The apartment costs, the utilities, the shared household expenses would be simpler to manage from a single account, she said. And she was right about this in the same way she was right about other things that were also vehicles for something else. She said it would make sense for me to be the primary account holder, given that my funds were being used for the shared expenses, and she would be named as a joint account holder with operational access. She used the phrase operational access, which was a banking term, delivered with the slight pride of someone deploying professional vocabulary in a personal context, and I remember feeling, absurdly, something like collegial warmth. She spoke the language. I remember signing the account opening forms at the bank, her bank, the Kasikorn branch on the Naklua road where she still worked, where another customer service representative handled the application while Mook sat beside me. I remember thinking that the forms were familiar in their structure, that the logic of them was the same logic I had worked with for 40 years, even translated through a different system in a different language, and that this familiarity was reassuring. I was in known territory. I understood what these documents were. I put £85,000 into the joint account over the following 3 months. Not all at once. In 4 transfers, each one authorized and logged and processed through my UK bank with the proper international transfer documentation, each one representing a considered decision to consolidate a portion of my savings into the shared account for the purposes of managing the Thailand life I was building. By November, the account held the equivalent of £85,000 in baht, at the exchange rate of the time, plus the monthly additions from my pension that I was routing through it. It was, I thought, a sensible operational structure. I did not check the account balance independently. This is the thing I returned to. The specific failure, the one that is most difficult to explain because it is so contrary to everything I understood about financial management. I received statements. I looked at the overall number. I did not scrutinize the individual transaction lines with the attention I would have given a statement at the Barclays branch in Swindon if a customer had brought it to me with a concern. I trusted the number. I trusted her. These 2 trusts were identical in my mind, which was the precise error. There were signs. There are always signs, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending would be dishonest and would also miss the point of telling this story. Mook began, sometime in September, to be slightly less present in the evenings. Not dramatically absent. She was still there, still engaged, still conversational. But there were phone calls taken in the bedroom with the door closed. And there were evenings when she was distracted in a way that she attributed to work stress. And there was a new watch on her wrist in October that she said a colleague had given her as a birthday gift, which I thought was generous, and did not examine further. There was a weekend in October when she said she was visiting a friend in Bangkok and came back on Sunday evening with a shopping bag from a department store that she carried directly to the bedroom. I noticed all of these things and I cataloged them in the same mental notebook where I cataloged every other small observation, and I did not connect them to each other, because connecting them would have required a conclusion I was not prepared to reach. There was an afternoon in October. I think it was a Saturday, though I have corrected myself on this a dozen times and genuinely cannot be certain, when I came back from the market along the coast road and found Mook at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a spreadsheet visible on the screen that she closed when I came in. Not quickly, not with the guilty speed of someone caught at something, but with the simple efficiency of someone finishing a task. She said she had been looking at some financial planning. I said that was sensible. I made tea. The spreadsheet was not mentioned again, and I did not ask about it, because somewhere below the level of conscious reasoning I had the instinct that asking would constitute a specific kind of question I was not ready to have answered. I returned to that closed laptop many times in the months that followed, not physically but in memory, as the piece of evidence I had and did not act on, the thing I saw and chose to name as something ordinary, financial planning. Yes, quite so. The financial planning of a woman who had already, by that point, decided something I would not learn for another 2 months. There was also the matter of a third key. I had 2 keys cut for the apartment when I moved in. In September, I noticed a third key on Mook's keyring, clearly a duplicate from the shape and manufacturer's marking. She said she had had a copy made for a friend, in case something happened to me and someone needed access. I said it was thoughtful, and she should have mentioned it first. She apologized and said she had forgotten. I left it there. I think now the third key was not for a friend. I think it was contingency, and the fact that I accepted the explanation I was given is one of the things I return to most in the long list of things I return to. In November, she asked me to sign some documents related to the apartment lease renewal. The lease was in my name as the primary resident, and the renewal required a signature on the new agreement, plus a separate administrative form relating to the building management company's records. She brought the documents home one evening, 3 pages, in Thai, and explained them to me in the summary way she had explained documents before. This is the lease renewal at the same rate. This is the building management registration update. Sign here and here and here. I signed. She took the documents to the building management office the next morning, she said. I did not ask to keep copies. The phone call came on a Tuesday in December. I was in the apartment, and Mook was at work, and I was reading, or attempting to read. I had a paperback I had bought from the second-hand English language bookshop near the Naklua market, and I was not, if I am honest, concentrating on it. The call was from the bank, not Mook's branch, a different branch of the same bank, the regional customer service number. A woman speaking careful English who introduced herself and asked if I was the herald whose surname and account number she read back to me. I said yes. She said she was calling about an overdraft situation on the joint account. She said the account was currently overdrawn by 47,000 baht and that a loan repayment had been declined that morning for insufficient funds. She asked if I was aware of the loan. I said, "Which loan?" There was a brief pause. The kind that happens when someone on the other end of a phone is processing the information that the person they are speaking to does not know what they know. Then she said the loan had been taken out in both account holders' names, with both signatures on the application, in October, for 1.85 million baht. At the exchange rate in December of that year, 1.85 million baht was approximately 41,000 pounds. I am going to try to describe the next few minutes accurately, which is difficult because the memory of them has a quality that is different from normal memory, more textured in some ways, strangely compressed in others. I was sitting in the chair on the balcony that I used for reading, the one with the slightly torn armrest that I had been meaning to get repaired. The gulf was visible over the roofline of the building across the road, a strip of gray-blue water in the December light. I had a cup of tea on the table beside me that I had made perhaps 20 minutes earlier and had forgotten to drink. I remember looking at the tea while the woman on the phone continued speaking and thinking that it had gone cold, and then thinking that this thought was an extraordinary thing to be having at this particular moment, and then not thinking anything coherent for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 30 seconds. The loan had been taken out on the 3rd of October. It had been applied for in both names. Both signatures appeared on the application documents. The loan amount, 1.85 million baht, had been disbursed to an account I did not recognize, which the bank representative described as a savings account in Mook's sole name at a separate financial institution. The loan repayments had been structured over 24 months. The first 3 had been made, presumably from the joint account, which explained the balance movements I had noted without examining, and the 4th had failed because the account had been drawn down below the required level. I asked the representative to hold for a moment. I put the phone face down on the table and I sat there on the balcony with the cold tea and the gray-blue water, and I went through what I knew in the way I had gone through irregularities at the Barclays branch in Swindon, methodically, starting with the facts and working toward the inference. The facts were a loan in both names, neither of which I had authorized, signatures on a document I had not signed, funds disbursed to an account I had no knowledge of, balance movements in the joint account that I had attributed to normal variation and not examined properly. The inference was obvious, and I sat with it for what the phone timer later told me was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then I picked up the phone and asked the representative to tell me the date I had supposedly signed the loan application. She said the 3rd of October. On the 3rd of October, I had been in Swindon. I had gone back for 2 weeks in late September to deal with some property matters connected to the house I still owned there, and I had not returned to Thailand until the 16th. I had the Ryanair booking confirmations still in my email. I had the GP appointment I had kept on the 4th of October in a text reminder on my phone. I was not in Thailand on the 3rd of October. I had not signed anything on the 3rd of October. and whoever had signed the loan application using my name had done so knowing, from professional experience, exactly how a bank verifies a signature and exactly how closely that verification is and is not scrutinized in a standard loan application at a mid-sized Thai bank branch. The confrontation that evening was not what I had imagined a confrontation would be, in the years before I had ever needed to have one. I had imagined, in the abstract, that a confrontation about a serious betrayal would involve raised voices and tears and dramatic declarations. What happened was quieter and, I think, more devastating than the dramatic version would have been. Mook came home at 6:30. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the phone and a notepad on which I had written, in my clear banking hand, the key figures and dates. I looked at her when she came in, and she looked at me, and I think she understood in that first moment, from my expression or from some internal clock she had been running, that the moment had arrived. I told her what the bank had called about. I told her the date of the supposed signature. I asked her to explain. She sat down across from me. She did not attempt the denial I had half expected. What she said was, I needed money. The loan was the way to get it. I used your signature from the apartment documents. I sat with that for a moment. The apartment documents, the lease renewal, the 3 pages I had signed in November, one of which, it would eventually emerge, was not a lease renewal at all, but a loan application, with my signature already placed on the page by the time she brought it home, traced or reproduced from the signature I had given on the original account opening forms, and refined, in the intervening months, by a woman who had spent years watching how customers signed their names and who understood, from professional practice, the specific characteristics that signature verification systems were designed to catch. I said, you knew how to do this because of your job. She said, yes. There was a quality to that conversation that I find, in retrospect, almost more disturbing than the fraud itself. She was not defensive. She was not particularly remorseful. Or if she was, the remorse was the shallow kind that lives in the register of inconvenience rather than wrong. She spoke about it with a directness that I would have found impressive in another context. The directness of someone who has been caught and has decided that honesty about the mechanism is preferable to a deniable story that will not hold. She explained, when I asked, that the loan money had gone toward purchasing a condominium unit in her name in a development in Jomtien, south of Pattaya, which she had been intending to sell within 12 months, at the premium that new developments in that area were expected to achieve. She had a plan. It was not an impulsive act. She had been constructing it, she estimated, since August. The money in the joint account was largely still there. The loan repayments had drawn it down by approximately £9,000, and some additional movement I was only now examining had taken a further £4,000 in transfers I had not noticed. But the bulk of the £85,000 was intact in the account. This was the thing that shifted everything that came after. I called Neil that evening. He came over within 30 minutes, which is the measure of a certain kind of friendship. And he sat at the kitchen table with me, and I showed him the notepad and the phone records and the bank reference number, and he listened without saying anything until I had finished, and then he said, "You need a lawyer tonight, not tomorrow." The lawyer, a bilingual Thai attorney named Kun Ratana who practiced in Pattaya and whom Neil had met through an expat network, was at the apartment by 9 o'clock. She was efficient and precise, and within 40 minutes of reviewing what I had given her, she had identified 2 critical elements: my demonstrable absence from Thailand on the date of the supposed signature, which was documentable through my UK travel records, and the fact that the joint account funds, the £85,000, minus the amounts already moved, were still technically present and accessible. What happened over the following 11 days was the most concentrated piece of financial administration I have ever been involved in, and I say this as a man who spent 40 years in financial administration. Kun Ratana moved to freeze the joint account the following morning through an urgent application to the civil court, citing the documented fraud. The police report was filed simultaneously. The loan-issuing bank, presented with the evidence of my travel records and the police report number, suspended the loan enforcement proceedings pending investigation. The condominium in Jomtien, which Mook had purchased but not yet sold, having miscalculated the timeline before the loan repayment failure triggered the bank's call, became subject to a civil claim as an asset acquired through fraudulent means. Mook left the apartment on the second day. She did not go voluntarily. She left because Kun Ratana had advised, and I had agreed, that her continued presence while proceedings were active was not advisable, and because when the police officers came to take her statement at the apartment on the morning of the third day, the situation became clear to her in practical terms. She was not arrested immediately. The Thai civil and criminal processes move on their own timelines, and I am not going to pretend the resolution was swift or clean. But she left, and the locks were changed, and the apartment became, for the first time, simply a place I lived, rather than a place we lived. I recovered 71,400 pounds of the 85,000 pounds. Not all of it, and not quickly. The process took 9 months and required my staying in Thailand, well past what I had planned. An extension I managed through the visa renewal procedure with documentation that Kun Ratana assembled with a thoroughness I respected. The 9,000 pounds in loan repayments drawn from the joint account was irrecoverable as a practical matter. The 4,600 pounds in other transfers that I had failed to notice went to the same category. The condominium proceeds, when the civil claim against them was partially settled, contributed to the 71,400 pound figure. The loan itself was eventually restructured and assigned to Mook's legal liability rather than mine, given the weight of the fraud documentation, though the process of achieving this involved more paperwork than I had generated in my last 5 years at Barclays. The vindication, and I am going to use that word, because it is accurate and because I am not going to pretend it felt like nothing, came from 2 directions. The first was financial. I got most of the money back. Not all, not without cost, not without 11 months of Thai legal proceedings, and the expense of Kun Ratana, whose fees were substantial and entirely worth it, but most. The second was, I suppose, professional. When the bank conducted its internal investigation into how the loan had been approved against a signature that could not have been contemporaneous with the stated application date, the investigation found that the branch where the application had been processed had not followed the standard verification protocol with the rigor it required. Several procedures had been truncated. Mook had, by that point, resigned from the bank, and the internal investigation did not result in any outcome I was directly party to. But Kun Ratana received a letter that indicated the loan liability had been reassigned in full and that the bank had made a goodwill payment toward the account for the repayments that had been processed against a fraudulent loan, a sum of approximately 190,000 baht, which at the current rate was about 4,200 pounds. I think about the irony of this often. The bank's own internal processes, the same kind of verification protocols I had spent 40 years implementing and monitoring at the Barclays branch in Swindon, were what ultimately confirmed the fraud. A signature that could not have been made on the date it was dated, verified against travel documentation, checked against the bank's own imaging of the original account opening signature. The system worked, eventually, in the direction of truth. It just required someone to push it in that direction, which is most of what Kun Ratana did. I left Thailand in October, 14 months after the December phone call from the bank. Not because I had to. The visa situation was manageable. The legal proceedings were concluded. Kun Ratana had done what needed doing. But because I wanted to, I packed my things in the Naklua apartment and shipped 2 boxes to Swindon through a courier service that Neil recommended, and took a taxi to Suvarnabhumi on a morning in October when the weather had not yet begun to cool, and the traffic on Sukhumvit was the usual creative disaster, and I sat in the back of the taxi thinking about what I was taking with me and what I was leaving behind, which is a thought process I had not expected to be as complicated as it turned out to be. Roger, my son, met me at Heathrow. He is 46, works in financial services in Bristol, correctly identified my capacity for irony even before he knew what had happened. And he had known the outline of the situation from several phone calls over the preceding months. At the arrivals barrier, he looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "How much did you get back?" When I told him, he nodded. Then he said, "That's better than most people manage." This was, I understood, the gentlest possible version of the observation he was entitled to make, and I was grateful for the gentleness, even while I sat with the accuracy of it. I am back in Swindon now, in the house I bought in 1987, which has appreciated considerably since then, and which is the most reliably profitable decision of my financial life. The £71,400 is back in a UK account. The pension continues. I am, at 74, financially stable. In the modest, careful way I have always been financially stable, with the bruise of the £13,600 that did not come back sitting in the accounts as a permanent reminder. Looking back, and I am aware that looking back is all I have done in this account, which is the nature of a story told from the aftermath. I think there are things worth saying clearly for the benefit of anyone who finds themselves recognizing any of this. I think the most dangerous fraud is the one that uses your competence against you. I was not defrauded despite understanding banks. I was defrauded partly because I understood banks, because I trusted the familiarity of the process, the known vocabulary, the structural logic of joint account documentation. The confidence I had in my own ability to recognize a fraudulent transaction when I saw one made me less likely to look for one in a context I had already classified as trustworthy. Expertise and vigilance are not the same thing. Knowing how something works in theory does not mean you will spot it when it is being used against you by someone who knows the same system from a different angle. I think a joint account, with any person you have known for less than several years, in any country, is a financial instrument that should be treated with exactly the same caution as any other financial commitment of its size. The emotional context of a relationship does not change the legal structure of a jointly held account. Both signatures have equal operational power. The money accessible to you is equally accessible to the other person, and their ability to access it does not require your awareness or consent. I processed joint accounts for 40 years, and I forgot this, in the specific context where remembering it would have mattered. I think that any document you sign in a language you cannot read, any document, for any stated purpose, in any context, however familiar and low stakes it appears, should be independently translated before you sign it, not explained. Translated, word for word, by a person you have engaged and paid yourself, whose only interest is your understanding. The explanation of a document is not the same as the document. I knew this. I forgot it in the context of a relationship I wanted to believe was straightforward. And I think, looking back with more honesty than is comfortable, that the frugality which had served me well for decades had a cost I did not recognize until it was demonstrated. I was so attentive to the small expenses, the prices, the fees, the exchange rates, the monthly account figures, that I had created a blind spot at the level of the larger structural decisions, the ones that required not arithmetic but judgment. I watched the pennies and trusted the pounds to the wrong person, and the pounds were what mattered. The thing that still troubles me, the thing that is not the money, the thing I said at the beginning was the actual wound, is simpler and more difficult than any of the financial analysis. It is that I was 70 years old, and I wanted something, and the wanting of it made me less than I had spent a lifetime being. That is not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. It is also, I think, the most honest thing I can say. I do not know what I will do next. At 74, the question has a particular quality of open-endedness that I find neither frightening nor energizing, but simply present, the way a weather system is present. You acknowledge it, you dress accordingly, you go on with the day. I still think about the morning walks on the Naklua coast road, the gray-blue water, the way the Gulf looked in the early light before the heat came. I think about the grilled fish restaurant near the coast where Neil and I had dinner on my first real evening in the place, before any of the rest of it happened, when the night was warm and the city was somewhere behind me and the food was genuinely excellent and everything was still possible. I think about these things without the overlay of everything that came after, which I am aware is a selective kind of memory, but which I am also not sure I am wrong to preserve. Some of it was real. The water was real. The morning walks were real. Even some of what I felt was real, or near enough to real that I still cannot fully separate it from what was not. That distinction between what was genuinely real and what was constructed carefully for my benefit around something that was real, is the question I am left holding. And I suspect, at 74, I will be left holding it for quite a while longer.